Welcome to Lawyers Who Care, the video show podcast that highlights attorneys who go above and beyond for their clients. And on each episode, we will meet a new lawyer and they will share stories about where they went above and beyond legal counsel for the benefit of their client. My name is Andrew Samelin. I am the principal of Samelin Wealth, a nationally recognized wealth management firm for lawyers, law firms, and their clients. And let's applaud lawyers who care and learn from them. Today, my guest is Syed Sean Bakari. He is an attorney with the United States Postal Service focusing on employment law. Welcome, Sean.
Hi. Well, thank you very much for having me on.
So, Sean, this is very, very interesting because generally speaking, we have attorneys who are in private practice. They are at, top 100 firms to sole practitioners and everything along everything in the middle. And today is the first time I've ever had anyone from a federal agency called the United States Postal Service, and appreciating some of the limitations that might put on some of our discussions today. I welcome you, and I can't wait to have this podcast.
Thank you very much. Yeah. It's I was a private litigator, for about a decade or so before I joined the Postal Service last year, and so I certainly am familiar with that world where most of your guests are from, and traditional litigation and all that. So now that I'm a govie, I guess I have a little bit more of a different perspective on things. So hopefully, that can make for some entertaining discussion.
So, by the way, and appreciating some of the limitations of what you can chat about, can you just speak about the size and the scope of the post office? Again, just so you know my bias, huge fan of the Postal Service. I am still shocked. I am absolutely shocked on how you can move a letter from New York to California in like a day or two for 60 cents. It is simply beyond me on how you could do that.
You want to talk about like size and depth. It's like a little incomprehensible especially when you're on the inside, like kind of looking out. We have a fantastic set of employees, so it's just, we managed to, it's an extremely complicated operation. There are all sorts of levels to this that obviously I'm, sort of restricted in what I can talk about, but even if I was fully, free to talk about it, it's just so huge, such huge in scope, that like, I don't even think I would be able to adequately describe it. It's enormous. It's a big machine, and it surprisingly runs well.
Yes.
So
yeah. Well, thank you for the service that you provide to everyone. And it's just fascinating. And I want to get to your story, but how they are responsible for going to a single house in some mountain in Appalachia or in a rural area of Louisiana, out to a farm in Texas, to someplace in Santa Fe, and just get it done. It's just shocking to me how you do it every day.
It is to me too, and like I said, like just me sitting in a lawyer position, it's, even I can't even like comprehend how smoothly that goes. So, it truly is impressive. And it's been, the Postal Service is, I think, the oldest agency of the United States. So, that just goes to show how long we've been at it. So, it's terrific, it's terrific.
And you were in private practice for a decade prior. What made you want to become an attorney, and what made you focus on employment law?
Well, so like I actually came into private practice through employment law. I throughout law school, I had a human rights focus. I did human rights clinics. I worked with a human rights litigation nonprofit for a little bit, and then that led me into civil rights and employment discrimination. So I worked with the EEOC for a little bit coming out of law school. And then I did private practice afterwards, for about 10 years. And, so I transitioned from basically the EEOC to a small firm downtown Baltimore that concentrated like 99% of its practice in employment discrimination for plaintiffs, representing plaintiffs. So I did that for about 3 years, and then I transitioned to a firm in Columbia, Maryland, where that concentrated primarily in small business litigation, commercial litigation, but I still did employment law while at that firm. I still brought in some employment law clients and things like that. So I kept sort of my foot in the door of employment law. Throughout my time in private practice. And that sort of brought me, I heard that the Postal Service was having an opening in labor law in their labor law group in the law department for the Postal Service. And I just thought it would be exciting to sort of, take what I knew through employment law and traditional litigation and expand my scope to the world of unions and grievances and things of that nature. So it's been an exciting ride so far. And like many lawyers who probably like 90% of the lawyers that you've interviewed, they could not have imagined that their career would have taken them down this path when they first started out, when they started applying for law school. Like they usually have one thing in mind, and the next thing you know, they're doing something completely different. And that's kind of like where it took me, although it's still, my career still stems from that idea that I want to be involved in, it turned from human rights, civil rights to workplace rights now, essentially. So it's always had that thread.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
Sean, tell us about the story that you shared with me a little bit when we were chatting before. Go for it.
Well, like I said, I started out my law life, I guess, involved in human rights, and so I had a wonderful opportunity to work with a human rights nonprofit in DC. They were called, I don't think it exists any longer, but it was called World Organization for Human Rights USA. And they focused on actually federal litigation in the United States for human rights violations. And that involved, like, for example, foreign human rights abusers, let's say, we've been involved in litigations against, for example, the leader, one of the leader for, I think it was the Democratic Republic of Congo. Okay. And I did that one actually after I joined the employment discriminations practice, and somehow ended up with a human rights lawsuit against the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is another story. But and getting back to World Organization for Human Rights USA. We were involved in human trafficking cases, and also cases involving, unfortunately, the United States government and the military. And that's what this story involves. We had a client who, obviously this is not his name, but we'll just call Abdul. Okay. He was Iranian. He was part of a group called the MEK, which is called Mujahideen al-Khalq. I'm sure I kind of butchered that, but it's, again, one of those instances where it depends if you view such a group as freedom fighters or a terrorist group, right? What we do know is that they have received on and off support from the United States government. They have, and they've also received on and off support from Saddam Hussein as well. So they basically fought against the Iranian government. The Iranian government, obviously the one we know, which is the Shiite cleric-led government. And so our client, he was involved in this group, and after a while he became a refugee in Iraq. And when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, they took over this refugee camp, and obviously they took over the refugees who were there. Abdul, being a refugee who was already there at the camp as a refugee, the United States soldiers who liberated the camp, they explicitly recognized his refugee status and the fact that he's protected under international law as a refugee, right? So he has the rights, under the 1951 Refugee Convention, as well as a whole host of international legally guaranteed rights. Well, unfortunately, things went south for Abdul pretty quickly. He kind of went on the outs with the MEK there. He also started protesting the poor conditions, the poor sanitary conditions at this camp. And the next thing you know, he was being beaten. He was being detained arbitrarily by U.S. soldiers and perhaps some other foreign soldiers there from European countries. He's not quite sure who else was there. Pretty horrific treatment. He tried to call his brother from there, and his brother was on the line, and the brother hears him being ripped away from the phone, kicking and screaming. Next thing you know, the U.S. troops, they ghosted him to Abu Ghraib, and this was in 2006. This was after the 2003 pictures and images of Abu Ghraib detainees being, we've all seen the horrible images. Anybody who was, of age back in 2003, 2004, right? We all know what that's about. Well, this was afterwards. This was after things were supposedly toned down at Abu Ghraib in around 2006, I think. He was brought there. He was beaten. He was kept in a tiny cell. He had sewage running through his cell. He and other inmates were put in a chair in an extremely hot room for hours with the sunlight beating down on them in the desert. They called it the torture chair. They, just horrible things. He was anally probed against his will.
How did you?
Yeah. So he eventually made his way to Turkey and then Switzerland as a refugee. And that part of the story was never really clear to me how that happened. But apparently that's fairly common for people in this situation, right? Before that, he was released from Abu Ghraib, put back in the camp, and then put back in Abu Ghraib again a couple more times. And then eventually he was released. And then it's not clear exactly how that happened, but the point being, he found his way in Switzerland as a refugee. Mm-hmm. So at the time, this was now roughly 2011, when we came into contact with him. He contacted our nonprofit. He, I'm not sure exactly how he did it, but the nonprofit has a network, a human rights network. We were affiliated with groups on the ground in Europe and so on and so forth. And he wanted to bring a claim against the United States government. And, like many people who have had their civil rights violated or human rights, he wasn't seeking any monetary damages. He just said, $1 is fine. I just want recognition of what happened to me, So, we actually talked with him numerous times through a very early version of Skype, and it was surreal being able to see him. We got to see his emotions, his reactions, just, how he, tried to compose himself as he was telling a story. And we had to talk with a number of, this is kind of getting the part about the above and beyond. We had to talk, of course, to a number of experts in the field of, how are these, how ghosting worked, how, the detainee practices in Iraq work, what the MEK was even about. We had to talk to a number of people about how the military process these things. So how does this involve military justice? So I had a chance to learn a little bit about that. But
you'll forgive me. And what did you get out of this case as we conclude?
What did we get out of this case? Well, the big thing is that these claims that we hear in the news, they're so complicated. There's so much more to this than meets the eye. Often we see this in terms of the war on terror and, due process, things like that. But there is such a big human side to this story. One of the big things we do is that we had to track down his brother because his brother was a witness. And luckily for us, he was a shop owner in Georgetown. So, we finally tracked him down. We figured out where his bookstore was. We took the bus out there, and we interviewed this guy for a couple hours, and it was just surreal. Like, him describing what it was like when he was on the phone, when he heard his brother being dragged away, and screaming. The efforts he tried to make to track his brother down. He tried to communicate with the U.S. High Command in Iraq. He was basically trying to find out what happened to his brother because he didn't hear from him for a long time, while he was in Abu Ghraib. And the other thing too is that what people have to understand is that if there's anybody out there who's listening to how to represent victims of human rights abuses, the road to justice is very complicated and long. I mean, like, we at the end found out that he would not have, our client Abdul would not have jurisdiction to bring a claim in the United States federal courts. There's a very infamous case about this called In Re Afghan Detainees, I think it was called. It was a federal district court case. If anybody wants to look it up, very harrowing details, but it describes how to bring a tort claim, in the United States federal court, really, detainees and during the war on terror couldn't do that, right? They did not have that sort of jurisdictional privilege. Okay, so it's not like filing a Bivens claim if you're, for a civil rights claim under the Constitution. So it's eventually what we ended up having to do is we had to file an appeal with the Organization of American States. Okay, so the United States is a member of that. But again, in terms of relief, it's hard to see how that would be satisfactory. But it's something we could do, unfortunately, other than public advocacy through the media and things of that nature.
Sure. Sean, thank you. By the way, I'd like to keep going. I just know that, your time is limited, as are these podcasts. So I want to thank you for joining us today. Just so everyone knows, today, our very special guest is Syed Sean Bakari. He's an attorney with the United States Postal Service. He focuses on employment law. And it's funny, Sean, normally I ask for folks, to offer their phone number and the web address. But that may not be appropriate here, but I'd like to thank you for joining us today. This has been the Lawyers Who Care video show podcast, where we highlight attorneys who go above and beyond, and Attorney Bakari is a fine example of that. Sean, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much for your time and for inviting me on. It was a great pleasure of mine.